Lawmakers are on spring break, but there's plenty to do when they get back. That's up next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me this week is Bob Gough, news director of WTAD and editor of thequincyjournal.com. Bob, thanks for being here.
Good to see you, Jamie.
And Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, thanks for being here again.
My pleasure.
Well, we saw a lot of things happen on the national level this week. On the state level, the lawmakers are on break, so it's a little quiet. But on the national level, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments relating to same-sex marriage cases. And Illinois lawmakers are also considering same-sex marriage. Charlie, how might we see some of the things that are going on the national level maybe trickle down to what's going on in the State House?
Well, I suppose the range of what the U.S. Supreme Court can do is pretty wide. They could stand for the proposition that the Defense of Marriage Act that was enacted in the 90s should remain the law of the land, in which case, as we were discussing before the show, this might provide more of a incentive here in Illinois to legalize same-sex marriage, because if the federal act stands, then a lot of benefits that are available to married couples would not be available to people who are in civil unions. On the other hand, if the court decides Defense of Marriage Act goes down, we're going to leave this up to the states to decide, then the federal benefits, as I understand it, would be available to same-sex couples, and maybe there would be less of a incentive to work for it in Illinois. Although my sense from watching the legislature over a long period of time is that they tend to, what's the polite way to say it? They don't want Washington messing in what they're going to do. They have their own agenda. They're going to do it for Illinois, and the heck with Washington. And we'll talk about gun control later, I trust, because there's a good example there of how Illinois reacts to federal courts.
Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the case so far, that the lawmakers that are pushing for same-sex marriage in Illinois are kind of saying, you know, we're going to take care of this issue here, we're going to address it here, and we'll see what the courts do. But Bob, I mean, what are you seeing folks, maybe some feedback on this? How are people feeling about this court case and about the decisions that are being made on this issue in the State House?
It's as divided, I think, throughout at Quincy, Adams County, and West Central Illinois as it is throughout the entire state and the country. It's been very politicized, and I think it's something that no matter what happens, you're going to have probably half the people who are happy and half the people who aren't. You know, and as far as the state and waiting on Washington, I think Charlie makes a great point. They're going to do whatever, and then if the state has to backtrack, so be it. The gun control analogy was a really good one. Again, it's going to, you know, it's going to be a 5-4 vote. You know, whenever we hear about it. Again, it's going to be very divisive, and there's just no easy solution for it. It's sad to say.
Well, and we have a while to wait for that. The ruling is expected in June, and as Charlie said, there are a lot of outcomes that we could see, so I'm sure we'll be revisiting that in the future. But Bob, you know, we're touching on some local stuff here. We're going to see a lot of local elections, school boards, local municipal races, and you said there are some trends that are kind of going on across the state. Can you tell me a little bit about what we're seeing as far as school boards go?
Well, I think when you look at a situation with school boards, you've got it where I believe, I know in Adams County, or at least in the Quincy School District, you've got the school district portion of your property tax bill is about 54%. Charlie and I were talking earlier, and we were talking, and he said probably the statewide average is closer to 60. So a significant portion of your property taxes are decided by what happens in school districts. The school districts right now feel they're being held hostage with the state of Illinois' financial situation. The state's constantly behind on payments to schools, like they're behind on payments to everybody else. It's a big problem, and a lot of school board members across this state are kind of throwing up their hands and not running again.
It's kind of a thankless job right now. Layoffs.
It is the worst. I just don't see why someone would do it. You can't make anybody happy. God love the people who do it. We've got 3 people who are leaving the Quincy School Board. We've got 8 people running, 3 incumbents leaving. We've got 8 people running for those slots. So when the new board is seated later in April, we will only have 2 school board members who will have more than one term of experience. So, and on top of that, the Quincy School District's also getting a new superintendent, 2 new assistant superintendents, principals throughout the district. Again, it's a very big transitional time, and I think it's a transitional time across the state because there are a lot of teachers who really aren't sure what's going to happen with this pension situation, so they're going to go ahead and retire now because they are going to probably, I think they are going to bank on the fact that if I'm retired, the state can't screw with my pension. If I'm still a teacher, might be issues, but if I go ahead and get retired, maybe I'm okay.
And there's not a lot of indication that that is the case, but that is the hope, it seems like, for a lot of folks out there. So, and Charlie, we've seen a lot of attention here in Springfield on the school board, but you were noting that the State Journal Register had a column talking about how there actually aren't a lot of people running in these municipal elections.
And,
if we look,
and if I can propagandize for the local paper, this was Sunday's paper. No one to run. And the Gatehouse Media, which is the owner of the State Journal Register, Rockford Register Star, Peoria Journal Star, looked at the local elections in 8 counties in northern and central Illinois, and make sure I get the numbers right. There are roughly 4,400 offices that are to be contested, ranging from village boards all the way down to the local sanitary districts. Almost 3,000 of them have no candidate or have only one candidate running for the office. And the question is, what kind of choice does this allow for voters when there's no one who's showing an interest? As a matter of fact, one of the areas, or one of the races that they highlighted here, village board president in Illiopolis, which is a town east of here, about 900 people, nobody is actually on the ballot. 2 people filed to be write-in candidates after the filing period closed. And the analysis seems to be that these are pretty much thankless jobs. You really don't get much pay, if at all. A lot of them are volunteer positions. And it's, you have people who've done it for a number of years and like it. Like you were mentioning, one individual on the Quincy board has been there like a quarter century. And not a lot of other people want to challenge an incumbent, and not a lot of other people maybe even want to get involved. And so the question becomes, how do we get more people to pay attention? The estimates are that the turnout is going to be pretty much south of 20% of the voters. And it's not just in downstate Illinois. The Better Government Association, this was also reported in the State Journal Register, of roughly 2,000 local government spots up in Cook County, and Cook County has 486 units of local government, if you can believe that. It kind of blew my mind.
I really can,
actually. Yeah, I can believe it. Unfortunately, yeah, we can all believe it.
And about 60% of them only have one candidate or nobody running for the office.
Charlie, is this typical for these kinds of offices? Are we seeing this as a result of all the budget cuts and the fact that if you run for these offices, you're maybe having to say no a lot now and do things that people don't like? Or why do you think we're seeing
I think
this?
that may play a role, but a lot of these offices are just so small and they don't have much of a budget, and you wonder, why do we have them? We have township tax collectors in Sangamon County. Why do we have a township tax collector? You know, you pay your property taxes in 2 installments. The first installment you're supposed to send to the township tax collector. The second installment you send to the county. Why can't you send them both to the county? And there's examples of governments that are very limited in their purpose. They exist to only do one thing, a soil and water conservation district. Believe it or not, mosquito abatement district, tuberculosis district. And I think the reason they exist is because under the old Constitution, it was very difficult to borrow money for capital improvements to do something else in the general government. And so the city couldn't borrow money to put in a sewer system, so they created a sanitary district. And those things, once they're created, they have a life of their own. It's the kind of thing not very many people know or care at all about this local level of government, but the folks who are in those offices care a lot.
Well,
and so it's hard to do consolidation.
Yeah, we see a perennial debate, I think, you know, pretty much every year in the General Assembly about getting rid of some of these local governments. We, by far, have the most local governments in the country. I used to know the numbers off the top of my head. I don't anymore, Charlie. You might.
Yeah, I actually wrote it down. Illinois has about 8,000, give or take. Pennsylvania is the runner-up. They have about 5,000.
Yeah,
so there's somewhere where we are number one. And it's
far and away number one.
Yeah.
So the fact that there aren't people running for some of these offices or you know, not being challenged at the very least, least, do you think that this will help lend to this push to want to get rid of some of them? Or as you said, are they just too big of clingers that they will never go away?
Yeah, I think the people who are running unopposed are doing it because they like it.
Yeah.
And it may be just a tiny little, what would you say, kingdom, but it's their kingdom.
Mm-hmm. And there may be stipends in some cases too. I mean, that's another, and not big ones. There might be something for that. Charlie was talking about turnout earlier. I think in Adams County we're looking at closer to 40% turnout because we do have a highly contested mayor's race between the two-term incumbent Democrat John Spring and Republican Alderman Kyle Moore. So I think that's going to help drive turnout a little bit. Also, this school board election, and of course the other 4 school boards that are in Adams County as well. So we'll still, I mean, it's still not, you're not going to get 75–80%, but the county clerk was talking earlier this week, and she's thinking somewhere between 35 and 40%.
That would be really almost a record turnout, I think, for the odd year elections, the so-called consolidated elections.
We had 4 years ago in the same vein, it was about 36% we had in Adams County.
Yeah, that's very good.
So.
Well, we've been at the national level and at the local level, and now we'll come back around to the state level. As I said at the beginning of the show, lawmakers are on their spring break. They're out for 2 weeks. There's been a lot of debate about whether this break should happen. They are, some of them, working in their home offices. I called a few today, and they answer the phone, so they're not necessarily on vacation, but they're not here in Springfield working on legislation. Bob, you know, there is some clamoring about whether they should be taking this break because there's still pension reform left to do, budgeting, all sorts of things. What are your thoughts on the break, and, you know, what are people complaining about it? Or
I think they can just stay away with the job they're doing. Just we'll see sometime when you figure something out. You're right. I mean, when you look at all the problems that this state has and the issues that they're debating, you know, the pension is the big monster, and it looks like there's been a little bit of movement on that in the House and Senate. I don't know if this break stalled any momentum because it's still hard pressed to see if you can actually call it momentum or not. But yeah, I mean, they're going to take the break, and, you know, everybody's going to take a little time off around Easter or what have you. But when they come back, you know, they've really got to get this thing settled. I mean, the pension monster's there. You know, we see it you see it at the local level. The TRS is obviously the big one, and we talked about the impact that it's had with teachers retiring in Quincy because they're not sure they're going to get their pensions. At the police and fire level, you know, those are a little more managed by the municipalities, so those aren't in as bad a shape because they've been, you know, if they're being good stewards of the government, they are actually paying their actuarials, they are actually doing what they need to do to keep up and keep pace, even though they're still severely underfunded. I don't think they are as in bad a shape as the state pensions are. But again, that's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that, you know, when they get back from break, maybe they can say, okay, we have these loose frameworks of plans. Let's see if we can get them through, and let's see who's going to howl the loudest, and we'll see if COLAs are really something that is something that some people believe is written in the Constitution or not. I think that's going to be one of the big sticking points, as one of many sticking points they're going to have.
Yeah, Charlie, editorial writers kind of enjoy, you know, railing on lawmakers when they go on these breaks. Do you really think it's that big of a deal? Or, I mean, some of the lawmakers said they felt like it was maybe some time for people to, like, cool off and maybe back down off of some of their positions.
Let me say that my background is I am a reporter. I've never been an editorial writer. And I like the line that editorial writers are the battle to shoot the wounded.
Well, as a reporter, I enjoy the break because we get some time to do enterprise stories. We get to breathe and you know, sleep at night.
And I don't think that this notion that you just keep going, right. There's no point in it. As somebody who's watched the legislature in action for 40 years, there is a rhythm and a cycle. And we went through a pretty hectic period that just ended a week or so ago, when each chamber finished dealing with the legislation that originated within that chamber. And so the House passed the House bills it was going to pass, sent them to the Senate. Senate passed the Senate bills it was going to pass, sent them to the House. So they switched sides. Now they take a break, they go home. As you suggested, most of them are probably in their offices meeting with constituents because it gives you a good sense, good feel for your district, and also it's good politics. And then they'll come back perhaps with new ideas, with a better sense of what their people want them to do, and they'll come back for the final push when the House will work with stuff the Senate has passed, the Senate will work with stuff the House has passed, they'll reach some compromise between the chambers, and ultimately something will come forward. For sure we'll have a budget. Whether we'll have anything else, remains to be seen. But that's been the case since 1818.
That's the one certain thing every session usually. And sometimes it takes longer than the regular session. But
the one other thing they're working on in break two possibly is they might be working on some of these municipal elections. I mean, let's take for example, Rushville Senator John Sullivan's dumped a ton of money and put staff into the Quincy mayor's race for Democrat John Spring. So I think they're probably doing a little politicking as well during this break, as as it's certainly their prerogative to do.
Well, the other big issue that lawmakers have been working on is concealed carry. As Charlie mentioned earlier, there's been a federal court ruling that gave lawmakers a deadline to pass legislation to regulate the carry of firearms in the state. Charlie, can we go back to that a little bit? You said you had a good example of how, like, the federal government kind of interplays with what's going on in the state.
It was funny because the decision by Judge Posner said that the state's ban on concealed carry was unconstitutional, violation of the Second Amendment, and yet there are state's attorneys and law enforcement people, particularly in Chicago, who are continuing to arrest people and charge them with unlawful, I forget the exact term, but it's basically with carrying a weapon, despite the fact that the federal court has said, no, this is unconstitutional. And the state's attitude seems to be, well, we don't have to do what the federal court tells us to do, which, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but I'm not sure how much wiggle room there is. Apparently, it doesn't count until the Supreme Court says so. But on the other hand, which level has ultimate jurisdiction? We settled that back from roughly 1860 to 1864, 1865.
Well, I mean, that's going to make for some interesting court cases when those folks start to go through the system, being charged underneath something that's seen as unconstitutional.
Yeah, if I'm the defense lawyer, I can say, well, Mr. Gough here, yes, he had this rifle. He was going deer hunting. You stopped him. You pulled him over and said that that's illegal. But the U.S. court has said that that law is unconstitutional. How can you charge him? You have to let him go. My guess is that that's probably not a good example, because my guess is that in Adams County and a lot of downstate areas, the prosecutors are kind of backing off. They're not going to. The issue is in Chicago, where gun violence is a real critical problem. But there have been cases of people who weren't using the gun unlawfully, in the sense they weren't involved in some other crime. They just happened to have one, and they've been arrested, they've been charged, and now they're working their way through the court, and the question is what's going to happen, and it's kind of a legal limbo, I guess would be the way to put it.
Well, that'll be an interesting quandary. I mean, we did see the court give the legislature this certain amount of time, 180 days, but what happens in that limbo period? I guess we'll find out when some of these cases start going through.
And the consensus seems to be that, and I think the period ends in early June, that at that point there is no law at all in Illinois to regulate the use of firearms. And so as the example that's used is that you could walk in with a semi-automatic weapon into the State House and nobody could stop you. And I think when that example came up, it opened the eyes of some lawmakers who were saying, man, we don't have to worry about this.
Yeah. Right now you have to go through a metal detector to get into the State House. So yeah, that would be a pretty big change. So when lawmakers come back, there will be a lot of issues swirling around that they may or may not deal with. Charlie, what's on your radar as far as things that you think may be big topics of conversation when the legislature comes back in?
Well, I think the perennial of gambling expansion, that will be there again, as it always has been. The governor seems to have left himself more open to accepting a bill. The legislature has sent him a couple bills in recent years, and he's vetoed them both. And in his State of the State, he talked about he'd be willing to sign one as long as there were no loopholes for mobsters, I think is what he said. So I'm not quite sure what that means,
and then
but I think they can
laughed.
And I think that was the only laugh line in the whole speech.
Hopefully, it was a pretty dire speech.
So I think there's room for a compromise here, and the big thing is that Mayor Emanuel of Chicago, really wants a casino in downtown Chicago for the revenue it would generate. Communities like Danville and Rockford want casinos for the revenue. And so there's that push. There's also the Horsemen's Association and the tracks that see allowing slot machines at tracks as a way to increase the revenue for the tracks, and therefore the purses that go to be used in the races. So there's grounds for a compromise there, and the question has always been the governor. And given the state's dire financial straits, the revenue that could be generated, the one-time revenue from selling the licenses, and then the ongoing revenue from having the additional gambling could be significant in terms of helping put together a budget.
And Governor Quinn said he'd like to see all that money go to education, but he did say in his budget address that he would be open to some of that money going towards teachers' pension costs, so that seemed to be an indicator that he might be more open to the idea as well.
Yeah, and to look at it historically, over the years, the governors have always said the money that they put into the teachers' retirement system in their budget counts as education funding. The education lobby has always said, no, it doesn't. I think the governors have probably been more on target in the sense that the pension benefits you earn are a kind of deferred compensation. And so they're part of the teacher's salary package. And so to count those as education funding is appropriate in my judgment. And so I think what the governor is saying is we will use this money, and if it goes to teachers' retirement, that counts as education too. It doesn't necessarily have to go into the general state aid allocation.
Well, and the Senate Democrats have added kind of a new wrinkle to this. They've tacked on the concept of having online gambling, like online poker and other online games that you could wager on. There's a couple other states that have passed this, but it hasn't been put into place yet. Nevada, New Jersey. This would really be the biggest gaming expansion we've ever seen. I mean, you would be able to gamble on your phone, presumably. Bob, I mean, what are folks willing to bear this large of an expansion after we've seen video poker coming into our neighborhood bars?
Video poker it came into some of the downstate communities. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of ministers who spoke up against it. It's sort of trickling in right now. Online is, if you're sitting there, at home in your laptop and able to do that, and the state's trying to figure out a way to get their chunk of it, they're going to do that. But I think when you look at, what the governor's trying to do, if they're going to continue trying to expand on that level, then why not expand at the other level? The other thing, when he talks about going into education funding, we all remember that when the lottery was first put into place, that was all supposed to go into education funding, and it went into education funding, and then other education funding got cut. So every time they say something's going to go into education, the money that's currently in education ends up going away.
So we may see Charlie kind of funneling in on this side and money going out on the other side, or?
Well, it's all part of the same pot. And as a matter of fact, when the legislature okayed the lottery back in 1972, the money was used to, in essence, cover for money that was going to the RTA, Mass Transit in Chicago. People thought it was for education, but it wasn't. And it wasn't until maybe 8 or 10 years later that they finally changed the law to say that the lottery money goes into education. But the lottery produces so little in terms of the state's contribution. It's not even 10% of what the state puts aside for education. The question I would have about this online gambling, once upon a time there was online gambling. And it was done through internet sites that supposedly were casinos in the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands or somewhere. Federal government cracked down on that by telling the financial community, the banks, you can't take credit cards for this online gambling. And so people would have had to actually set up an account in the Bahamas to be able to do this, and so it kind of went away. So if Illinois legalizes online gambling, I'm not sure how that would work with the federal interdiction against it.
Well, it seems like we've kind of opened Pandora's box on that, because the ruling that we got from the Department of Justice to sell lottery tickets online and do online lotto, other states and some folks believe that allows for states to legalize online gambling, and 2 states have done it, although they haven't put it in place yet, so we'll see what happens.
But to me, the distinction would be who would be running the gambling? Would the state of Illinois itself have its online casino?
I think the idea is that, I mean...
And the reason I say that is because the feds allowed us to do it, but we still had to control the lottery. We couldn't contract it out to some other company to do in our name. We had to have management control over it.
Under Cullerton's proposal, the lottery would administer online gaming, but then they would contract to casinos, presumably. It doesn't say, but they would contract it out to other people who would run the sites, but the lottery would oversee the whole shebang. There definitely could be some major legal questions about this. It seems like something that's just kind of being floated out there, and we'll see what happens. But Bob, anything on your list as far as what you're watching from the State House when lawmakers come back?
Like I said earlier, I think pensions, that's going to be the big thing, or which plans are going to come together and how are they going to mesh. Whatever changes are made, you have to believe that the teachers' unions are going to probably go at them and talk about their constitutionality or unconstitutionality. I mean, I think when you look at it, obviously a pension is something that is guaranteed in the Constitution, but that's a pretty broad definition. As I said earlier, are COLAs guaranteed? If you're giving someone a COLA and the cost of living adjustment, and then all of a sudden you take that away, is that detrimental? I mean, that's something that the courts are going to decide if they can't get that decided here. And again, that's going to be something that whatever happens and whatever law is passed regarding, or whatever reform is passed during pensions, it's still going to go to the courts. It will. And of course the judges will not be affected.
Charlie, we're seeing this really, and I know we chew this over often, but it's such a big issue. We see this difference between the two chambers on what is constitutional. They're pretty far apart right now. It doesn't seem like they'll meet in the middle. Do you see any possibility for compromise? How do we see this shift when they get back? Could it happen?
I suppose it could, and we may wind up with something like what Senate President John Cullerton originally proposed, where you craft a bill that has two different parts in it. One, the part that basically says we're going to change your benefits, tough, and the other part that says we're going to change your benefits, but you're going to go along with it because we're going to give you something else. And not to get into the intricacies of it, but basically the Constitution says that membership in one of these retirement systems is a contractual relationship, and that the benefits can't be diminished or impaired. Now, if it's a contract, if you and I have a contract, I can't unilaterally change it, you can't unilaterally change it, but we can both agree to make whatever change we want. Right. And so I'm a member of the State University retirement system, and if I ever retire, presumably I'll get a pension. But I could sign a form and say, I'm going to forego all my pension rights, and that would be okay. On the other hand, CSRS can't say to me, we're going to take your rights away. And that's what the contractual relationship is. And so what Cullerton is proposing is that in return for accepting a lower cost of living, we will give you access to state-subsidized health insurance. On the other hand, if you want to keep what you have now, you have to forego that state-subsidized health insurance, and we're not going to count future pay raises towards what the calculation will be for your pension.
And I hate to cut you off, Charlie, but we're out of time. But you think that combo plan that Cullerton is proposing with both components may be what we see in the end as far as a compromise?
That would be a way to meld the two positions, yeah.
And I'm sure we'll be talking about it again next week and probably the week after that on Capitol View. I'd like to thank my guests, Bob, Charlie, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.